Good afternoon, good morning to everyone. I am Srini Nagarajan, Head of Asia for CDC, and a warm welcome to everyone on the call. I'd like to welcome everyone to launch this report towards a just transition finance roadmap for India. CDC is very excited to launch this report along with our partners, Grantham Research Institute at LSE and the Observer Research Foundation. While the concept of just transition is relatively new in India, the goal of creating decent jobs has always been a focus for development financial institutions such as CDC. Now, because CDC is facing multiple challenges, India is facing multiple challenges of climate change, including floods, heat, stress, and water scarcity, we must simultaneously tackle climate change alongside other sustainable development objectives, such as decent work and gender equality. This is even more pressing given the ongoing COVID circumstances in the country. We need to replace the jobs and the livelihoods that have been lost and the investment in green sectors that can be a part of the solution. While India is the third largest emitter in the world and currently responsible for close to 7% of global greenhouse gas emissions, that share could rise rapidly as energy demands rise, as people aspire for better quality of life. India is making significant strides on the renewable energy generation side. The country currently generates around 95 gigawatt and has set an ambitious target of 175 gigawatt by 2025. If you look at the recent G7 communique, it says that coal power generation is the single biggest cause for greenhouse gas emission. Globally, around 39% of the coal plants are uncompetitive to renewables. And in developing countries like India, it's a much higher number. And moving away from coal will definitely cost billions. The most recent solar auctions we saw at around 1 rupee 99 paise or 2.7 cents per kilowatt hour in India implies that India has opportunities to save money by decommissioning old coal plants and replacing them with renewable energy. Having said, the transition from coal is a journey, and there are three main things to bear in mind. One is the governance, the regulatory framework for roadmap as far as the transformation is concerned. Second one is the people and communities. We need to look at the livelihoods of communities in coal sectors that employs around 600,000 people, 600 million people. So fundamentally, I think if you try and look at the behemoth like Coal India, the largest coal miner in the country, it generates a gross profit of around $3.2 billion last year. And there are a number of sectors which are then dependent on coal, like the railways in India is one of the largest employers. And the revenues from coal help the railways subsidize the tariff for poor people, really. And there are several state governments such as Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, which also depend on coal as a very significant source of income and tax revenues. And the third important aspect to bear in mind is the infrastructure, the plant decommissioning and the repurposing of these coal-fired plants and the reclamation of the coal mines. On a very related point, I must point out that geographies where renewables tend to benefit are not the same where the coal is located, really. The east of India has the coal, and most renewable capacity is coming up in the other parts of the country. Equally, the skills for coal miners and the solar player operator are quite different. And we need to make sure that we make use of this just transition and make sure that the 600,000 people are not left behind in the process as much as possible. Climate action, including just transition, is a strategic priority for CDC. CDC's updated climate strategy, which was launched in July 20, outlined our climate ambition towards three pillars. CDC's targets achieving net zero emissions from its portfolio of investments by 2050. Under the second pillar, we will invest to improve climate adaptation and resilience in our geographies. And the third one is CDC will support the just transition to the future low carbon economy for workers and communities. Climate finance is growing in importance as an investment theme for our South Asia team. I'm glad to say that we launched our foundation right from a PowerPoint presentation and formed an entity in 2018 called IANA, and to develop the solar and the wind generation, especially in the underserved states of India. And today, this vehicle has got 1.7 gigawatt and now plans to scale up to 10 gigawatt by 2025. And it's a vehicle jointly sponsored with the Government of India vehicle, NIIF. So it has got 1.7 gigawatt now, and it's got $700 million for it to develop further. As we as CDC look at our next 5-year strategy, India offers the scale and the opportunity to meet our climate ambitions. And so we will look at to make investments in sectors such as renewable energy, both utility and CNI, electric vehicles ecosystem, smart metering, microgrids, etc., while ensuring alignment with a just transition. This report will make an important contribution to our collective understanding of how to finance a just transition in India. We're glad to see the report outlines the types of investment opportunities that can deliver on social and climate objectives, as well as products that can be leveraged, including green bonds and just transition aligned lending by banks. The real test for financing a just transition will be in major emerging economies like India. While just transitioning historically has focused on developed economies such as the UK, Europe, and the USA, the size of the transition required in emerging markets like India requires our focus. In the last 10 years, annual global energy transition nearly doubled from 290 billion in 2011 to 500 billion in 2020. High income markets accounts for just over half of this total investment over the last 10 years at around 2 trillion. However, in 2020, with high income markets recording at a 24% year-on-year increase in investment, while emerging markets experienced a 21% contraction. This calls for a climate leadership in emerging markets, combined with the right mix of policy enhancement and commitment by both the private and the public sector. Therefore, we really encourage everyone, including the investors, banks, businesses, and government, to read this report and take note of the next steps. Finally, I would like to let you know that this project will be publishing more insights ahead of the COP26 conference in Glasgow in November. So please stay tuned for more. Thank you all so much, and wish you a very lively session today. And I will hand it over to Annapurna.
Thank you very much, Srini, both for the very good introduction to the topic and for introducing our report so well. I'm Annapurna Mitra. I worked as an economist at the IMF currently, but this is work I did in a previous role at the Observer Research Foundation, which is one of the partners on this project. And I want to just give you a quick summary of the report itself and our results and how we see this moving forward. So very quickly, just to let you know that we really do what the title says. What we're trying to do is figure out what a just transition looks like in India, how it can be leveraged by the financial sector in order to create new instruments and direct finance, right? And most importantly, we want it to be of practical use to investors. So really, please do put feedback in the chat box, get in touch with us later, and let us know what would be useful to you, what we should focus on going forward. This is work done in collaboration with Suranjali Tandon of NIPSC and Nick Robbins at the Grantham Institute at the LSE. Next slide, please. So just to give you a brief overview of what we're looking at here. The first step here is that we start with a net zero emission scenario for India. And of course, we know India hasn't formally legislated one yet, but it's increasingly clear, I feel, that both for Indian citizens and for the planet at large, it's going to be crucial to legislate this sooner than later. And with the Just Transitions agenda, we want to address some of the impediments that arise in policymakers' minds when they think of this. More specifically, the trade-off they see between India's development agenda and its climate targets. And of course, there can be trade-offs. Equally, there can be synergies. So what can we do? What can the financial system do more specifically to expand on and exploit these synergies to the maximum possible while minimizing the trade-offs? And as Srini just said, basically decent work and economic growth along with climate action are at the center of this agenda. If you look at the diagram on your screens right now, we see that as the biggest, most important goal. And our idea is that once you start to address that, the remaining sustainable development goals start to flow from there. We take them alongside. And so this is an agenda essentially for integrating development and climate action. And this is a whole of economy agenda, but we look at the financial sector essentially because investment is critical. The numbers are staggering: 4.5 trillion over 10 years, 200 billion US dollars annually. That money has to come from somewhere. The money exists. Where should it go? How should it be done? How can we maximize the benefits from it? Next slide. So when I talk about minimizing the trade-offs, how we look at it is that climate action and climate policy, as a consequence of these things, there are essentially four big social risks that can arise. The first is to livelihoods, and most importantly, I think. And livelihoods are, again, as Srini just mentioned, things like coal workers, etc., with jobs will be phased out, but also jobs in sectors like agriculture, which employs about half of India's workforce and is very much at risk due to climate change and global warming. Equally, there's the question of energy access. Indians consume very little energy per capita, and we don't want to be locked into this scenario just because we're moving towards climate policy. We want to have more energy, but clean energy. The third is public finance. So I'm sure some of you know this, but still I think the numbers worth touching upon at least. 18% of the Indian government's revenue, center and state combined, come from fossil fuels. So that's coal, petroleum, and electricity duties. And it's a bit more for states, especially for coal-heavy states, a bit less for the central government, which has revenue, but nonetheless, 18% is a significant amount. And as we've seen with the COVID crisis recently, any sort of transition or shock needs a social safety net in order to avoid people being left behind. So finding alternate sources of public finance will be crucial to provide that cushioning so that shocks don't send millions back into poverty or job loss or general vulnerability. And finally, there's the vulnerability indicator. And this essentially measures how capable a population or a community is of transitioning to new forms of work or new ways of living. And we measure it using standard human capital development measures. So that's health outcomes, education outcomes, and per capita income. And I do hope some of you will read the report and get more of a sense of how we did this. But the idea is that a certain minimum level of human capital development is required just to make a workforce agile enough to be able to transition to a new set of activities. And once we put these risks together, we use it to identify which parts of the country will be most hit by the green transition. And again, just as Srini said, it's mostly the usual suspects. They're the coal-rich states towards the east of the country. So Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Bihar, Odisha, Telangana, Rajasthan, etc. They're the 8 states in red on your screen. And what's common among them, of course, is that livelihoods are at risk in all, but also at least 2 of the other social risks we identified. Additionally, 7 of these 8 states are coal-producing states. And what does that tell us? It tells us essentially first that there's been the standard resource curse, which operates in many countries around the world, is also at play in India. Natural resource rich regions tend to be left behind in terms of development outcomes. But more importantly, while India as a whole faces this challenge of managing development alongside the clean transition, the states that are most developmentally challenged are also the ones most at risk from the green transition. So it's really important to make sure that these areas which might struggle themselves to get investment or attract business are supported along their paths to doing this. Next slide, please. So this is just, I won't spend too much time on this slide. I just want to put this out there so you get a sense of the ecosystem we're looking at and how broad our perspective is. So in yellow out there are the social stakeholders, which are workers, communities, and consumers. And these are the people we want to protect. And the orange circles all around, so that's government, business, the financial sector, domestic and international, regulators, policymakers, etc. These are the people that need to work together in one direction to make sure that there is a green transition and that it's just. Next, please. So just quickly, I want to go through a few entry points that we found. What can the financial sector do? And I'm not going to go through all of them. Again, please do read the report, but let me just talk about the banking sector because I think that's interesting. And also, I think bank capital is one of the biggest sources of finance in India. So of course, banks lend, we know that. What do we want? We want the proceeds to be used in projects which are just transition aligned. which of course will bring us to the question, what is a just transition aligned project? And we have a sense from the last slide, right? One that addresses either human capital vulnerabilities, energy access, etc. But I think important here is to understand that policymakers need to step in and define a taxonomy which includes not just green aspects, but also social justice aspects. And that's key. If you look down the last column, pretty much every sort of instrument needs a taxonomy to support it. And alongside, we need regulatory action, which is, for example, RBI has a priority sector lending framework. So how can the priority sector lending framework be used to, again, direct bank capital towards activities which are aligned to the just transition? All right, next slide. And I'll just go briefly over this. As I said at the start, this is really a research agenda. This is the first step in trying to develop a set of practically useful products. And we want to look at three main areas of interest. The first is investment opportunities and financial what instruments are needed, how can we bring on board, how can we build engagement to get awareness of the just transition, and what sort of innovations can arise as a result. The second is financial policy and regulation, which, as I said, is key. So we need to look at taxonomies and disclosure requirements and other regulations to make sure that policymakers are helping investors match to the right type of project. And last but most important really is financing real economy action. That's where the actual work will happen. So we really want to be able to look at these places we identified, see what projects exist on the ground, how aligned are they to a just transition, and what roadblocks do they face in getting finance and scaling up, and what can the financial system do to help. Let me stop here. I really want to hear from the discussants and their views. Over to you, Nick, and thank you very much again for joining us.
Great, thank you, Annapurna. Thanks for that presentation, and a real delight to work with you on this report. So please, if the panelists can join me, Priyanka, Neha, Shrestha, and Chantal, please. My name is Nick Robbins. I'm a professor in practice for sustainable finance at the London School of Economics, and a real pleasure to work with CDC ORF on this project, and also Suranjali Tandon, who will close us off and end this session. So we've got a really good sense about why just transition is so important, and outlines where the financial sector can support this. What we're going to do in the next session in this panel is really get under the skin of some of these issues, and look at particularly some of the practical next steps to take on this sort of early emerging issue in India. So to do that, we have Priyanka Dhingra, who is Senior Manager at the SBI Mutual Funds. We have Neha Kumar, who is the India Program Manager of the Climate Bonds Initiative, Shrestha Banerjee, the Director for Just Transition at iForest, and then for Chantal Naidu, who is the founder and Executive Director of the Rabia Transitions Initiative, and also linked to SPRU in the UK. Importantly, Chantal actually is based in South Africa, which speaks to one point about this particular initiative, is that with CDC and this work in India, we're also working with partners in South Africa. And I think Chantal will be able to give us some really interesting comparisons between the situation, opportunities, risks in India and those that exist in South Africa. So we have a rapid fire session of about 5 minutes each, so please keep to time if you can. And Priyanka, if I may, I'd like to ask you to give your reactions to the report and some of the sort of priorities and next steps from your view as an investor. Over to you, Priyanka.
Thanks, Nick. And it's just a pleasure to share this panel with so many illustrious people who worked so hard on this report, and as well as they're working so hard on just transition, the concept itself, and developing the just transition paradigm in India. I actually work as an ESG analyst at SBI Mutual Fund. So maybe I will reflect on this topic from an investor's perspective. And of course, I'll talk about the report and how, the basic things that from an investor perspective are plugged in. But let me just reflect upon the total concept in India. It's at a very early stage today. So we are just trying to understand the concept more. The understanding around low carbon transition itself is evolving in India. And this entire space where the stress has to be laid on the justice component of low carbon transition is still lesser understood, I would say. Amongst the investors also, this is gaining traction, but again, we need a lot of players like iForest and CDC and yourself, players who can actually tell us what this means for us in the long term. So yes, definitely there is an awareness which is growing, but still we are aware, away from that critical mass where we can start engaging meaningfully with the companies that are there in our portfolios. Having said that, I would say that there is a huge uptake in the low carbon transition initiatives in the Indian corporations, whether we look at the disclosure side or we look at the initiative side. So just to give a few statistics, that in 2020, we got to know that 220 Indian companies made disclosures on Carbon Disclosure Project. There are multiple number of Indian companies who are adopting and the TCFD framework, and it's gaining more and more acceptability at this point of time. 59 companies gave third-party verified data on Carbon Disclosure Project, and we've seen 52 companies who have already had SBTi approved targets. So this means that low carbon transition is actually becoming very meaningful for these companies. We've seen some of the highest emission fossil fuel based companies set very ambitious targets for climate change, and carbon reduction, renewable energy. Recently, one of the biggest oil refining conglomerate in India announced its plan to invest around 10 billion US dollars in green energy over the next few years to reach a target of carbon neutrality by 2035. The state-owned thermal power company of India has also announced doubling of its renewable energy targets to 60 gigawatt by 2032. Same is the case with the state-owned coal mining company in India, which is now going towards diversification to, aluminium smelting, to aid the EV aim goals of India, and to look at, diversification towards solar panel manufacturing and even coal gasification. Because somewhere down the line, everybody understands that low carbon transition is extremely critical and they have to survive. However, on one side, we do understand the risk of stranded assets, but the risk of stranded workforce and communities is still lesser understood. So as long-term investors, we are very interested in talking to companies to make them understand that there is a real risk that there'll be a huge amount of workforce which will be stranded once this low carbon transition is fully made. And the companies need to invest not only capital, but also a lot of policy dialogue, a lot of skill development, retraining has to be invested in these areas, to train the workforce and to sustain livelihoods where their standard assets are located, to help the populace over there. So the investor interest in just transition is not only because we are long-term investors and we look at the NDCs that the country has set. We are also very interested because of the global coalitions like Climate Action 100+, who lay stress on indicators like just transition and the entire low carbon trajectory that countries have to follow. So in Climate Action 100+, there are about 575 investors with a total AUM of about USD 54 trillion, AUM. So that means there's a huge traction around this investor group, which is leading the charge on climate change, low carbon trajectory. Now, they are in the process of making in their benchmarking process an indicator, which is typically on just transition. It's in a very discussion stage and currently stakeholder discussions are going on. But the gist of the entire indicator is that there could be a 4-point process. One is to acknowledge that, just transition is important and the justice element has to be brought to the fore. The second is commitment. Once you acknowledge, then you commit that, okay, we are going to do something about it. There has to be action around just transition. The third is engagement, because the entire dialogue depends upon stakeholder consultation, consulting the workforces and the communities around just transition. And the fourth one is to act. So once you have the policy framework, you have the understanding, how do you actually go about supporting those low carbon initiatives so that the transition is just? In this process, we do face a lot of challenges also. So the first and the foremost thing is that investors themselves do have a little less understanding about the just transition paradigm. And the companies also have a little less understanding about just transition. Whenever we talk to companies, they look at it as a social indicator and they tie it to the corporate social responsibilities that they have. they are mandated to spend 2% of their 3 years profit for CSR initiatives. And somehow they do end up tying just transition to those initiatives. As investors, we know that there is a lot of interest in green activities and funding. We see that the ESG funds in India have grown from 2 to 10, with the AUMs, ranging from 3,500 Indian, INR crores to about 10,500 INR crores within a span of 2-3 years. So we know that there is a lot of potential, but there's also a lot of gap in understanding, and we want to de-link it to CSR so that the companies adopt just transition into their low carbon trajectory and start funding these activities as a part of their low carbon transition plan.
Great. Priyanka, I'm going to have to stop you there. This is a wonderful panel, but I just wanted to maybe come back in the questions. So thank you very much. Apologies for that. Thank you so much. Neha, if I could turn to you, from the perspective of the bond market, particularly sort of green bonds, climate bonds, and so on, very dynamic, and also the policy framework and so on. So Neha, over to you, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And first of all, congratulations to everybody around the table, from I think the first round table more than 2 years ago in an IPFP hall to a fantastic report and a wider set of stakeholders today. I think it already talks of the importance as well as the interest amongst diverse stakeholders on this topic. So yes, the last slide that Annapurna presented and said about the financial instruments, as you also pointed out, and also the policy and regulation side, which probably will give me a chance to speak on the taxonomy aspect of it as well. So I'd love to take that on. You have spoken about the numbers. Everybody has spoken about the numbers in terms of the investment need that is required. It is anywhere between 2.6 trillion to 3.2 trillion USD on transition as well as resilience put together. If you look at India, what kind of financial instruments have really pushed forward this kind of transition, I would say that green bonds have had a pretty successful run since 2015. And I'm speaking about India, but that is also a picture equally relevant in the global landscape. We've already crossed about a $1 trillion worth of benchmark. So that's huge, but that's not nearly enough. Both globally as well as talking of India as well. So in India, cumulative issuances till now in green bond space nearly touch about $19 billion. But I would say that we are really batting very much below our potential, and there is the reason for that is. That, and I will come to the just transition aspect just in a bit, but just to understand why there is such a gap between what can be done and what is really happening, is that demand continues to outstrip supply, but we still do not have a pipeline of projects. And I bring this point up because this will probably be a similar concern when we add on additional features. Now, you asked me about, so what can green bonds really take this new version on? And I would simply say yes, absolutely. One, and there are two reasons for that. And I think it is about the feature of green bonds, which is basically well understood. It is a simple instrument. Investors, they have tested it. In fact, a whole lot of other instruments have, in the thematics space, have taken from how green bonds have really gone forward. So in terms of the main feature, which is the use of proceeds, which is the transparency around where you deploy your capital, I think that is an extremely important feature, and that will equally apply to any additional feature, whether you call it, in this context, we're talking about just transition. So if you were to imagine a green bond 2.0 or a green plus, I would say that definitely there is scope, and probably, as Priyanka was mentioning, there is also appetite. If you look, in India, and the first thing that will come to your mind is who would be these people who would actually be I would say, rather eager to understand and use this instrument. And the first set of stakeholders, in my opinion, would be the public sector units. Many of them, in the thermal power sector, have renewable energy diversification plans. For them, it is extremely important. I mean, it is part of the strategy for most of the corporates, whether public or private. But definitely, the social aspect of it is high on the agenda. So I think there is a captive, audience over there who would like to add this additional feature and go to the market. And how would green bonds?
Neha, 1 minute, please.
Okay, sure. And how would green bonds help in that sense? Is that the same use of proceeds angle will help them, that you would have the transparency over, over where your money is going. I would simply, now I'll just go to the second topic, and 5 minutes is less. It is about taxonomy. How would you identify? I mean, it is about actually identification of those activities. How would you really go at the level of activities and say, this is what incorporates just transition, and this is what, how do you screen in, how do you screen out? This is going to be a complex process, and I would just like to mention over here, wearing my hat as a working group member of the taxonomy working group, that we are very much conscious of the fact that when we talk about green transition, that social dimensions have to be taken together. There is no separate social taxonomy. It is these social dimensions which are looked at par with environmental objectives that will make our work slightly complex, but it'll also probably help open up the entry points into that pool of capital. So it's not only green, you can enter for green, but you definitely have to meet the social dimensions of gender inclusion that you mentioned. Just transition as an objective is very much encapsulated in our thinking. So you could also enter from the social side, but also actually look at the environmental objective that must be integrated into how you will carry out your project and call your activity sustainable. Just last point, Nick, and I will end there. I think when we talk about social dimensions or just transition, these will play out very differently from how environmental criteria play out. Mm-hmm. So there will be an aspect of quality, there will be an aspect of performance, there will be an aspect of process, and all of these things will need to be disaggregated at the activity level. SDGs also will probably filter in at that level. So I think that process is on, and I would love to continue this discussion on different thoughts later on. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. And I love that image of coming into the just transition either through the green door or the social door. I think that's really, really a nice way, because I think all of what we've heard so far is we don't want to see the just transition as another layer, more complexity, creating this sort of just transition unicorn, but actually making it a sort of a practical task for finance and other stakeholders. Thanks so much, Neha. I'm going to turn now to Shrestha Banerjee from iForest. Really love to get your perspective, Shrestha, on this, particularly from that sort of regional place-based dimension, which has been at the heart of your work. So Shrestha, over to you, please, for 5 minutes. Thanks.
Thanks, Nick. And I was really happy to see the 4 key pointers that Annapurna had in fact highlighted will be the components. And the assessment showed that there are issues of vulnerability, there are issues of livelihood, there will be issues of energy access, and then there are issues of revenue. And it is a lot of money or resources that will be required to address maybe all of this. When we look at the map of India and the scale, the states, Annapurna just highlighted the states, but if we look at the district level, it's at least 60 districts are at the verge of a transition in the next 10 years. So it's a huge, huge challenge we have immediately. But I feel that just transition is also an opportunity to look into some of the things that didn't go right and to tap onto it through the opportunities that are currently there, as we are envisioning, energy transition, a green growth, and of course now a recovery from the COVID crisis as well. So the place-based strategy is definitely important given the amount of money, because for India, it will be a huge issue and we cannot put all the money together, but definitely we can start doing something small at the local level where there are resources already in hand. And if we go to the states and districts, today, a lot of their money, actually not lot, I would say, from coal. The direct revenue is not too much from coal. In fact, it is a lot to the center right now because it is going as the coal cess, which is right now the GST compensation cess. But what the states and the districts had is some very localized funds that come through direct contribution by the coal mining companies. One of them is the District Mineral Foundation funds. Then there has been the CSR investments that these companies have been doing. And then there are also the welfare activities that with or without the CSR mandate or right now the District Mineral Foundation funds, the legacy coal companies have been doing. Now, the point is, how do we tap on these resources? And that will be critical. So District Mineral Foundation funds has started in 2015. And right now, the amount of money just with coal districts is 184 billion Indian rupees. So it's a lot of money. In some of the districts, I'm saying, they are getting, they have about 10 to 20 billion rupees already in hand, like, in districts of Jharkhand or Chhattisgarh or Orissa. And this money is just in the banks. It comes directly as a contribution, and it is also attracting interests. But the point is, how do we use this money? The good thing is that this funds have the mandate exactly what Just Transition will do. And Neha was just telling me, she mentioned a very important point, like, how do I identify what activities we need to fund? And some of the basic point is that India will need a broad-based transition. There is poverty, there is underdevelopment. You need to build the community resilience in even to convince them that a transition can happen. Otherwise, there will be huge social resistance at the local level. So what these funds give us the opportunity is to start building that community resilience and build and invest in those social infrastructure that will be necessary to build their confidence and to prevent any sort of shock. And funds like District Mineral Foundation and CSR is much smaller, but I'm not belittling its scope, gives us the opportunity to invest in drinking water, in livelihood, in access, in healthcare, in education. These are the priority issues. So if we start building on that, and the institutional mechanisms are already in place, which is emphasizing on a bottom-up planning, engaging the stakeholders, which experiences of Just Transition is showing around the world. So if we build on this, there is a huge opportunity, I feel, of place-based strategies. That's number one in terms of finances. And I feel another, it is not directly finance, but it is in fact the repurposing of land and resources.
Rest of 1 minute, please.
Yeah. With the coal companies. I mean, there is nearly 0.3 million hectares of land currently with coal mining companies and coal-based power. So going ahead in the next 3 decades, instead of, trying to get new land or other things, this can be tapped as a resource. It's not a financial resource, but it is a huge resource to attract investments, which can indirectly feed into that. So I feel these are the 2 critical local level opportunities, and there are other resources which can be pulled together. And I agree with Nick here, and I'll finish with that I don't believe Just Transition should become an issue in its isolation, particularly at this level, because then it will fail. There are many parallel programs always run by governments, and then it becomes an issue of planning, monitoring, and implementation. So the better it can be integrated into various things that are already in place and the ideas, I feel it has a better opportunity of forgoing. Thank you, Nick.
Fantastic remarks, and I really underscore what your last comment. I think it also was touching on what Priyanka was saying, that actually, certainly from our work on this, the just transition has to be part of sort of core strategies, let's say, for climate change from investors or financial institutions. If it's a separate issue in the corner, we'll fail. So it's the connective tissue which links the environmental and the social. So thanks so much for that. And also, I think, thanks for giving us some sense that actually where we can start. We don't need to start from scratch. We can build on things. And I think that's also a really helpful signal. So thanks so much, Esther. We're going to leave India now, and we're going to go fly across the ocean. And Chantal, welcome from South Africa. Well, great to have you, and also the other part of this project with CDC represented. And really good to get your reflections on, obviously, what is happening vis-a-vis just transition in South Africa, but also just reflections on what you've heard as a real leader in sustainable finance. So Chantal, over to you, please.
Thank you, Nick. And thank you for inviting me to join this discussion. It's been very encouraging listening to everybody this morning. So I'm gonna kick off with, I guess, a critical question we're grappling with in SA is how to make justice a driver of the transition rather than a follower, you know, in that context. And also what has been said with the other panelists, how do you make it integrated, as Shrita said, integrated into the fabric of what we're doing and not just another compartment that finance gets wedged into. So I'll speak a little bit about our challenge and our aspiration in SA, but maybe some background first to South Africa, a middle income country with lots of rich resource endowments, a very turbulent political history which changed in 1994. And that was really a trigger, meaning that justice, social and economic transitions actually are quite familiar issues in South Africa. To some extent, we have transitioned, but still are transitioning and making that political transition. So our familiarity with the concept of just transitions means that there's some basis for profiling the social issues in the financing context. So it's actually become part of how business is done in the country, and a very these legal and standards and frameworks that the finance sector have that they adhere to in terms of integrating, you know, the previously disadvantaged persons. So while we have some record of our past efforts, we also have a record of how it's manifested in the real world, and the jury is still out on whether, you know, the way we financed our political transition and its consequential effects has actually been successful or not. I won't shy away from the fact that the international and national media has shown evidence in the recent days of a social unrest, and there's a lot of complex reasons why, you know, this may be happening, but one that is standing out on the ground at the minute, which we're grappling with in the last few days, is our abject levels of inequality. We are not a poor country, but we're just a rich country with lots of poor people still in it. So researchers say that at least 20% of South Africans control almost 70% of the country's resources, and we still have unequal access to economic opportunity. So the political transition creates space for our financial sector, but the impetus was different. Environment now drives our just transition journey, and we face a critical point in terms of our response, especially our energy system, largely reliant on fossil fuels. Despite bountiful solar resources, we have 72% of sunshine hours a year, and we ranked as the 12th largest emitter in the world in terms of carbon. All of this, our energy system is entirely around Eskom, a power utility that manages distribution, generation, and transmission. And so it's a kingpin in how that inclusive and just process unfolds, which is not a simple task. Institutionally, there are challenges with debt levels, aging infrastructure, which has led to energy blackouts. So the sense of urgency and razor edge need for us to transition technologically, but also underpinned by our inequality, makes doing this in a just way really critical. And it's not a small task. And as very similar to what others have said, the country's coalfield energy value chain affects entire regions' lives and livelihoods. And in some regions, there's generational dependency. When the elder retires, the juniors and others take up those jobs in the mines and in that coal value chain. And also, I think similar to what Srini said right at the beginning, we have geographically misplaced solar resources in one part of the country and the coal dependency on the other. So we have place-based issues similar to Shweta's mentioning as well. So our response to the Paris Agreement is firmly focused on achieving a just transition. And I understand we're the only country to have added this as a prerequisite in our NDCs. So we cannot act on climate without considering the social. Institutionally, the focus on just transition is represented at the highest levels in the country. It's the primary focus for the newly established Presidential Climate Commission. Our National Development Planning Commission also conducted nationwide discussions and workshops with people on the ground on what does just transition look like in their regions. So in one province, for example, it was agriculture. Climate change was resulting in loss of jobs in the food value chain, not just the energy value chain. So there is also that sectoral dimension to the just transition, which we're grappling with.
1 minute, I'm afraid.
Sure.
Sorry.
Okay, so ESCOM has created a Just Energy Transition Office, which makes it a very strong institutional effort to develop a portfolio of interventions, but that's going to require some financial innovation. And then we've got a massive slew of knowledge production via think tanks and universities looking at the cost issues, policy and regulatory shifts, and social discussions amongst labor, business, and government engaging in it. I'll close with a few things on 2 levels on where just transition financing is landing. One at the ESCOM level, where we are in intense conversation about securing a large facility or facilities to initiate and accelerate our decarbonization journey because of ESCOM's place in the country. And then also at Mpumalanga, which is a region very much affected by, would be very much affected by a shift to clean, and looking at a portfolio of projects there to better understand that. And we're looking at it through the lens of ambition, the interdependencies of projects, and whether our financial system can support the interventions. And perhaps I close with just some of the questions we're grappling with. First of all, the baseline of our economic and social fabric, and having a just transition on the basis of an unjust baseline, for example. And then there's conversations around time and, can we do an orderly transition? Another critical issue is how do we get the financial sector to move away from a single project focus towards transformative portfolios of interventions? And then the 2 last points would be on financial innovation. So Nia spoke about green bonds and its uptake in India. It's very much here as well. Our investors are very much considering that, looking at it, toying with it. We don't have the scale yet that she's described for India. But the biggest challenge is we're not just looking at quantity of finance, we're looking at the quality, and especially in international context, that terms and conditions and the impact it has on our fiscus. Not doing it in terms of small pockets of financial discipline, but also embedded in the fabric. And I will close with the policy challenge. How do you get policy to be very prescriptive about the direction and impact of a just transition, but be flexible on means of implementation, just given the fact that it has to be co-created with such a broad group of stakeholders? Thank you, Nick, and back to you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Chantal. And I must say, the South Africa President, Cyril Ramaphosa, I think has really been a leader internationally, speaking at the US Biden summit. I mean, really making clear the importance of just transition in South Africa. So I think really from the top down, as you say. So thanks very much. As we know, our only real non-renewable resource is time, and we're up against time, unfortunately. I would love to go on for another 2 hours with this fantastic panel, and indeed all the other people who've spoken, Srini and Annapurna and so on. So we have about a minute each. We've got some nice questions that have been coming in, and thanks very much for those. Really about sort of the application of this. Agriculture has come up interestingly, the place-based dimension, the potential for transition bonds and so on. I think picking up on what Neha was saying. So I would really like if I could turn to the 4 panelists and ask your thoughts and your suggestions, practical suggestions for the next phase of this work in India. As Annapurna said, so far this has been sort of laying some of the foundations. Just some thoughts about what, in a minute or less, what you would recommend to focus on in the next phase, and then I'll hand over to Suranjali, who will close us off. So maybe if we can start in the same order, but please quite brief. Priyanka, I cut you off earlier, so back to you, please. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I mean, from the recommendations perspective, I would say that two most time critical recommendations is one, awareness generation. Second is policy dialogue between the center and state. I think that's extremely critical. So the regional variety that we have of resources would require a lot of center and state related dialogues in policy, where the corporates will be at the helm of things, specifically the state-owned entities. I think it's very important to create that nexus where all these policy dialogues can be started. From the awareness perspective, we already know that investors are interested. So there should be more and more knowledge creation on this topic so that just transition dialogues can be taken up in engagement processes that we have with the companies. And again, as everybody mentioned, that just transition can, basically start from whatever's there already. There are huge pools of ESG funds, green bonds, there are CSR funds. All of these have to be tied in very nicely with the just transition paradigm that we are talking about. And that will actually serve as the starting point. But of course, it is all bound by the awareness that investors have and they're going to acquire along with the conducive policy framework that develops around it.
Very helpful guidance. Thanks so much, Priyanka. So Neha, in terms of sort of next steps, where should this project be focusing its attention?
Yes. So first of all, we have to absolutely be clear about that without just transition, the transition itself will not be stable. I think it will be inherently fragile. And that needs to be understood. In terms of policy dialogue, in terms of taxonomy, I would put that as an essential next step, simply because it is important to understand what counts as a just transition activity and what doesn't. So a lot of thinking has to go into that. And as for the climate, we say that there has to be a net zero target. I think for just transition and environment and green transition together, I think I would like to call it net positive gain in terms of livelihoods, in terms of income gain, just minimizing the adverse impact of dislocation, and all of those things will come in. So net positive gain, I think, is the benchmark and the yardstick that we have to take when it comes to just transition. So from my point of view,
I'm going to have to stop you there. I'm going to have to stop you there. We're really out of time. So I love that. I love that. We'll hold that. Shrestha, to you for your just closing remark, please. Thank you. Sorry, Neha.
No problem.
So, Nick, just 2-3 quick points. I feel as the next step, the primary thing is that we should not think it as a major issue. Like I would suggest take baby steps. That will help in establishing, and very rightly said, the state-center relationship will be crucial. For center, coal is still a win-win. For states, it is not. Some states are already experiencing coal mine closure and the loss-making issues. So here, states have a clear interest in moving towards a just transition if the right instruments and the right policies can be put forth and discussed with them. And that will help the center to develop a policy. So that center-state understanding will be very critical to initiate this process. The second thing I would say will be extremely important is to create some of the good practice models by tapping into local resources and at least, tapping into the interests wherever they are, because that's how government works. Everyone is look out for who else has done what and where it is happening. So if we can at least have this too in the coming years done, alongside all the other things that we need to do, it will help to generate a lot of momentum. And the biggest issue, I'm just saying it again, that the political economy of the coal regions are very, very critical. The local political interest, the local entrenched people's vulnerability, their fear, just transition has to deal with it. I mean, otherwise we'll fail. So this is my point.
I have to cut you off there, unfortunately. And then Chantal, if you could just close, and then we'll go over to Suranjali. So yes, your thought, just some contributions. Where should we be focusing next? Thank you.
Great. So a few people have said about the dialogues that need to happen. If I can just encourage that those dialogues are very specific about the direction and the impact. Because the financial innovation will follow through on that, but don't leave it up to imagination, be very specific, and what that needs are to express that, so that the needs drive the financial innovation. I would also say that I don't know to what extent this might be relevant for India, but it is for us, considering if our financial system in South Africa is fit for the purpose of supporting just transitions, not just at a national level, but also at the smaller state level of where finance and access to finance plays itself out. And not just the big deals, it's actually smaller pockets of funding. And that goes to the last part, that recognizing, as in all of this innovation is happening, the interdependency and how actors relate to each other, the large actors, the small actors, and different parties, to make sure that there's a mutual dependency to create a space for just transitions to be financed adequately. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. Thank you, Chantal. And thanks everyone for the questions. We'll aim to respond to these. This is a live project. And Suranjali, I'd like to hand over to you to really sort of close us out and to think about sort of next steps of this project. So over to you, Suranjali, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And thanks everyone for joining today. This has been an ambitious project of knitting together and sort of defining what just transition means for India. I think each of the panelists have alluded to the different dimensions, and I seriously urge everyone to look at the report, because all of these are dealt with in some sort of detail. But I'd sort of start at the very top to say that, what we're talking about today is not new to policymakers or to economists or finance. We're talking about redistribution. And redistribution always has to be generic. It cannot be specific. It cannot leave anyone behind. And so just transitions is the new form of redistribution. It's also an opportunity to correct for all the wrongdoings of the growth in the path, which is sort of a path correction for countries that are looking to bring together communities that have been left behind. So for that, as we've illustrated in our paper, in our report, is that there are serious risks to public finance because of the collections from fossil fuels. And therefore, private finance needs to step up its game and recognize the risks that exist already in the system. So it is not as if these don't. The SDG reports have already alluded to this. So the Just Transition agenda actually knits together all these SDGs to say that, look, there needs to be a comprehensive framework. And to this, I would say that any sort of regulation that brings together all the pieces of successful regulations that we've put in place in terms of disclosures or in terms of compliance should be brought under the net of just transitions so that every regulator talks to the other in a common language. And of course, every investor has expressed, and you will see that in the report, that there needs to be a clear definition which talks about taxonomy, which Neha had already spoken of. And I think that is the core of the problem. We need to say, what is the aim for us, right? And I think the elephant in the room is also coal. We're talking about what would coal look like in years to come. The G20 communication recently shows that the Indian government is looking at climate change very seriously. And of course, coal is an important source of energy. So how companies would want to react to this transition is absolutely important, in which case investors can sort of handhold companies to tether their policies to a just transition. And we already see that happening, right? You have sectors like cement, oil, transport sort of taking up the challenge and also issuing sustainability linked bonds. Of course, there are different actors which Annapurna had shown in her slide, and I wouldn't want to go through them in detail, but I'd say that each of these actors are important for us, at least in the next phase of work. We know that DFIs and MDBs play a very significant role to sort of bridge the financing gap. There are private investors who will bridge the financing gap for lack of public finance. And to assess the risk and show the way, there are rating agencies, there are impact investors, and corporates who can sort of link in this entire system of finance. So I would say that the next phase would look at each of these and engage with each of these to sort of create a more comprehensive just transitions agenda for India. Thank you so much.